I hesitate to talk about Andrew Tate because I don't know that much about him, you know. I can tell you what I know and what I think, and people can take it for what it's worth. I mean, the first question is, why is he so popular? And the answer is, well, if you have to choose between being depressed and anxious and laying downstairs and covering yourself with Cheeto dust and looking at pornography and being timid and never going out, or, you know, listening to someone like Andrew Tate who says, like, get the hell out there and take the world, like, that's better. That's the shadow, right, speaking in some ways, right? Like if you're naive and timid and anxious and intimidated and useless and resentful, there's going to be a bit of a monster that needs to call to you to say, you know, gird up your loins and get the hell out there in the world. And so it's better to be a monster than a rabbit in some ways, right? Or at least there's some utility in the more monstrous predatory path that isn't there in the pathetic rabbit path. And that's partly because if you are a pathetic rabbit, you're going to become a predator anyways. You're just going to become a dark, backdoor, backbiting, gossip-mongering, resentful monster.
Society's also pushing that on men in
yes,
particular.
Constantly.
Like, be
well, and
weak.
I knew, look, I knew, and I warned people repeatedly that if the culture kept emasculating men, that men who said, to hell with that, I'd rather be a monster, would become extremely popular. Now, and Andrew Tate is emblematic of that in many ways, because the first thing you got to say about him is that he's genuinely tough.
He was very, very, very smart person.
Right? So that's not a front. That's not a front. He's a fighter. And you can't take the courageous element of being a fighter away from someone who will actually step in the ring. Right? And so now, you said Tate's intelligent, and what that means as well is that some of the things he says are going to be of value. Now, why he says those, that's a whole different issue.
So once I was there, he told me about the webcam stuff. It was something like women who want to do webcam stuff, like they already want to do it. I help them make way more money, and I take a percentage.
Like, I'm not very fond of the whole online porn thing in any way. And I don't think that it's okay for young women to monetize their sexual attractiveness online. I think that leads to a very dark place for them, even if they're successful, because becoming successful
hurts your soul.
You don't become successful by exploiting yourself. And you might think, well, I can exploit myself. It's like, you can't treat yourself like a psychopath would treat you and get away with it even if the psychopath that's doing that is yourself. That doesn't work. That's why psychopaths aren't very successful, because they exploit themselves just like other people. And so I don't like the whole online porn thing. My understanding, and I've watched him apparently agree to this characterization online. You know, it's hard to get I'm not trying to be the jury here because I haven't heard the whole damn story, but from what I've watched is he would enter into relationships with women and tilt them in the direction of generating like an OnlyFans following and monetize that and then take a percentage. And there isn't anything about that that I think is acceptable. You know, and you could say, well, you know, women are the captains of their own soul, and if they want to monetize their own attractiveness, then what the hell, why not do it? And if they're going to do it anyways, you know, I can help them, and if I help them, why not take a piece of the action? And the answer is, to me, the answer to that is, well, how about because it's ignoble and wrong? You could counter, and you could say, well, you're just too useless and timid to dare to do that. And I'd say, you know, point taken. You know, Nietzsche had pointed this out back in the 1850s. He said, most morality is cowardice in the guise of morality. It's not like I'm good, it's just that I'm afraid to do that. And Tate would say, well, if you're just not doing something because you're a coward, that doesn't mean you're good. And whereas I'm forthright and tough, and look at me, I climb into the ring, and, you know, I can entice women into, you know, sex work online and take a cut, and why the hell shouldn't I? And I think that if you're a timid and reprehensible, resentful, bottom-dwelling male, that's going to look like an attractive alternative. But it's not the highest form of human behavior, right? It's not acceptable. Like, I think pimps of any sort I truly believe they're amongst the most contemptible of people. I think there's nothing in, you know, the pimp is, I've got all these hoes and look at me, like, you know, king of these women. And it's like, no, you are the ultimate in pathetic, parasitic predators. There's nothing about that that's heroic. It's just pathetic. Now, you might say, if you're that type, well, at least I'm not as contemptible as the cowards who hide behind me. It's like, fair enough, you know. There's ranks of order even in hell, and there's lower and higher demons, you know, and the person who would like to do something terrible but is too cowardly to do it, that's a pretty damn low form of demon. But that doesn't mean that the person who would like to do something and is courageous enough to do it, even though it's bad, isn't also a demon. And so, you know, I think fundamentally that Tate serves his immediate self in this like impulsive, gratifying manner. And I think that goes along with his, you know, look at me, I'm in a Bugatti. It's like, you know, fair enough, man, in some way.
Do you think what he's been telling men more on the, you know, take responsibility for your life and do things, if that, I mean, it's hard to, I suppose, separate it from everything else.
In actual life, people are complex. No villain is simple. No villain is simple, you know, and in great literature, the great villain is a sympathetic figure. You're kind of on board for 75% of it. And not only that, you might also say, well, if I was in that position, I might do the same thing. Like, it's only a cartoon villain who's 100% evil. Even when you meet someone who's dark and psychopathic to the core, you'll find, and I've had clients who were like, I had one client who had like 5 restraining orders out against him. He was actually quite comical. He's quite a young guy, small guy, kind of slight, extremely intense. You know, he had that kind of human shark thing going. And he was quite the horrible riotous blast to work with, because he was a very interesting monster. And 5 restraining orders is a lot.
Yep.
And restraining orders don't work on the sort of people who need restraining orders. So don't be ever thinking a restraining order is going to help you. Not if a real monster's got you in his sights. And he had a paranoid end to him. And what that meant was, if he was ever insulted by you, he would blow the insult up, and it would put enmity between the two of you. So like, talking to him was quite the nightmare, because you didn't get to make a mistake. And he was hypervigilant because he was paranoid. So he's just watching you like a bloody hawk for every deviation from honesty. And like, I never lied to him. And if I thought he was doing something stupid and terrible, I just told him that looks to me like that's pretty stupid and terrible. Like, there was I wasn't playing with him, and I wasn't trying to impress him. And I talked to him for a long time. You know, you go into an institution sometime, you meet somebody with bureaucratic personality disorder, and they decide that the good thing to do that day is to just screw up your life with some idiot complication just because they can.
It's my job.
Right, yeah. Well, you know, I have to do this. And they're playing their little power game because they're like Dostoevsky's underground man, and they're resentful to the core. And so they're going to just screw around with you. Well, now and then someone would do that with him. And he'd say, I'm going to be your worst nightmare. And then what he meant was, I'm now going to commit a sizable proportion of my life and all my intellectual prowess to making you as miserable as I can possibly imagine. And then he would go do that. You know, and there was actually, this is in, oh yeah.
Well, maybe
right.
you shouldn't be a bureaucratic nightmare.
Well, right. Well, and then see that, and that was the weirdly admirable part, right? It's like, you know, because typically what would happen in a situation like that is you'd go into the bank and you'd just swallow it, and then you'd go out and, you know, go home and kick your dog and bitch at your wife because you didn't tell the bureaucrat to, you know, watch the hell out, or something terrible is going to happen. Well, he was way on the other end of the distribution. It's like, don't muck with me. And he was an honor code guy. It's like, don't muck with me. And what he meant was, don't muck with me. Now, and he meant it. And there was something admirable about that, you know, even though he was a very dangerous person and he had taken it way too far. But this is what I mean by complexity of the villain. It's like, well, he had the courage of his convictions, let's put it that way. You know, and so when you see someone like Andrew Tate, well, first of all, if you have any sense, you think this is a guy that's actually crawled in the ring. And the second thing you think is, well, just because his moral compass is warped, and warped in a serious way on the like electronic pimp front, and like, I think in a fatal way, personally, that's the highest likelihood, because I don't think you can do that without it permeating everything. That doesn't mean that, you know, he's a two-dimensional villain, you know, or that there aren't things about him that are complex and interesting and potentially even admirable, you know. People are complicated, and even the villainous types are complicated. And it isn't surprising to me at all that he's an attractive figure, given the current, you know, war against masculinity. He's exactly the same. He's 100% predictable. He's exactly what you'd expect.
Would you talk to him?
You know, I pretty much talk to anybody. I thought about, whether or not that would be a good idea. For me, generally one of my primary driving forces is just curiosity.
Yeah.
Like, and I am a clinician, I like talking to, I've talked to lots of very strange people, lots of them. And it's very interesting to do that because you're really wandering into no man's land. And that's perilous and ridiculously, crazily interesting. That's what I loved about, part of what I loved about being a clinician. Like, almost everybody is interesting enough to be a Dostoevsky character if you start listening to them. And so just ordinary people, if you listen to them, they're ridiculously weird and interesting. And then you find someone truly weird and interesting and listen to them, it's like you can hardly stand it. Carl Rogers talked about this, he said people won't listen because they're too terrified of changing. Because, if you listen to someone, they tell you how weird they are. You share in that self-revelation. It's too interesting. So, and I'm sure talking to Andrew Tate would be too interesting.